Okay, I know a lot of people are taking the US history test today, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. The garden party is a little bit of a longer piece. It's maybe, I don't know, 10 or 11 pages long, so I want to go through that with you. Before I do, there are a couple of announcements. I would like for you to be thinking about whether or not you want to have a class period tomorrow to ask me questions about the study guide for the exam. We do have a B day tomorrow. So if you want, we can get on a Zoom at the normal time and you can ask me questions from the study guide. I am not going to like just try to go over the second half of the semester's material. I'd rather target the things that you would want me to talk about. So be thinking at the end of class, I'm going to ask you whether you want to go ahead and do that or whether it'd just be better for you to have a day where you can finish things up or, maybe you don't need that. So I'll ask you, be thinking about it. And then that way you can weigh in at the end of the period, whether you want to do that sort of thing tomorrow or not. I also want to mention that today is the last day for course evaluations at STC. So let me go to where you can, I put a link in the classroom, but you can also go to, let's go into the course. So if you go into the Blackboard course, you can go here where it says course evaluation and you can click there, but I also put it, and I think I put it as a reminder for today. Let me go to, I put reminders sometimes just so that you see them in with your Google stuff. Yeah, course evaluations closed today, so there's also a link here. It's really helpful if you do that. I know I've mentioned that many times, but the reason I keep mentioning is because they give me updates every day of how many students have completed it. And I think it's like 1 per class right now. So it'd be good if you did those today. You don't have to spend a lot of time making notes. You can just, click the little buttons or whatever. But I think that that's super helpful for those of us who are always looking to improve. So, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to do just to give us an idea of what we might have done well and what we might not have done well. My long-term retirement plan includes teaching online for colleges once I'm done with this day-to-day classroom building situation. So it'd be good for me to know some things that I could do better. We can always improve. Just be polite, The last thing I wanted to mention is that tomorrow, at the end of the day, so 11:59 p.m. is going to be the last day that you can turn in any coursework. Some people have not turned in discussion 7 or 8 or 9, should have been finished on Monday. Some people have yet to turn in essay number 2. Now, obviously, if it's late, it's going to be penalized as late, but I will still accept them and grade them. So there's some grade there until tomorrow night. Tomorrow at midnight, all those are going to close and you won't be able to access them anymore because the focus is going to shift to the exam, which starts on Monday. So you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to do the exam next week, and that's where your focus should be. So if you're missing something, I've already put a 0 just as a placeholder in the gradebook here on campus at East, and then also the STC grades. So if that's you in any of those things, then you have until tomorrow night to complete them. And then after that, it's just focused on the exam. If you have everything in, then I'm working on grading those things. The papers take a little bit longer, obviously. And next week, I'll be grading the exams as they come in. So each day I'll be looking to see who turned in their exam, grading them so that those grades can start to get posted. So by the end of next week, you should start being able to see what your final grades are here at East and then also with STC. So any questions about that? Oh, there's Jolie. All right, let us go to the calendar. Today, our discussion is on Catherine Mansfield's The Garden Party. I did put, we're not going to do it, we're not going to watch it in class today because it's almost a half an hour long, but if you go, let me go to the student view. Just in case you wanted a little sort of like visual support for this piece, I did find a fairly decent video presentation, and I linked it under additional materials in the 20th century unit. So there's this adaptation. It's in America, it's not in Britain. It's kind of in the country. There's some changes that are different a little bit. But it does do a good job of capturing what Catherine Mansfield, what it seems like she was trying to do in the piece. So if you wanted, it's like 24 minutes long. If you wanted to, this is a pretty good version that you could watch to kind of like get a visual on the piece. So I put that there just in case you were interested in that. But today we're going to go through the story. There is a study guide for that, so you might want to open that up. If there, at the end, after I talk about the piece a little bit, I'll ask you if there are any of these questions that you want me to spend some time talking about. This is our last class period to go over material, for the course. So today is pretty much the wrap up of the term. So if you have any questions on this one, then maybe you could be looking those over while I'm talking about the story. You can also get a copy of this story under readings. The PDF is here. So I'm going to go through the PDF. I've already made some notes on it so that you can follow along and maybe jot some things down. So I'm going to go to my version here. The Garden Party is written by Catherine Mansfield, and this piece is autobiographical in some ways. Authors very often draw on their own life experiences to write. That's not unusual. Probably, a little bug in here. Probably it didn't happen exactly like this. She's probably dramatizing it for the purposes of demonstrating the social classes. This piece is a lot about recognizing our behavior with other classes of people as society has designated them, and it's about a young woman's realizations in that area. And so probably we can assume that Catherine Mansfield had such a realization. And it's not really resolved in this piece, but it is brought forward and in many ways brings forth the idea of at least thinking about class designations and at least thinking about how we treat one another across those divisions. Because in this piece, we have a well-to-do family that is throwing a garden party, and there are workers that are like setting up the marquee, which is the big tent like this one here, right? The big tent where the party is going to be going on. And so there's very obviously the wealthy family and then the working class, the ones that are there to drop off the food and the ones that are there to put up the tent and the worker people. And then there's also a group of people who live off the property but nearby, who live in sort of a tenement. And so all of that comes into play for Laura Sheridan, who is the protagonist of this story. I want to point out that the story starts in media res. We've talked about that before, that term meaning in the middle of things, and that is a hallmark of modernist writing, especially in fiction. And we saw that with the mark on the wall. On the mark of the wall, she says, I've been sitting here looking at this mark. So it's kind of like nothing led into it. There wasn't, like we're just sort of dropped into this moment. So here we are again, dropped into the moment of the weather was ideal. So we're going to have this garden party type setup. No, it was a sunny day or the Sheridans lived in an outside, area, like, you know what I mean? Like there's no lead in, there's no, kind of traditional exposition. So in this first paragraph, there's a description of the garden. It's called Garden Party. Now, for British people, I don't know if you know this, British people have slightly different names. They speak English, obviously, but they have different names for things. Like an elevator is called a lift, and the car hood is called a bonnet. And they have different names for some things. The bathroom is called the loo. So in Britain, the garden just means like your backyard. For us, a garden means there's plants, right? Like it's a section where you put vegetables or flowers or whatever. There may be vegetables and flowers in your garden in Britain, but it just saying he's out in the garden, if you say that in England, then that means he's in the backyard. If you say he's out in the garden in America, we tend to think, okay, he's picking carrots or something, right? Like he's fertilizing the roses. So there's just a slight distinction there. They do have a garden in this piece, but the word garden is kind of like a general backyard kind of term. In any case, the piece starts with this day being described and a long description of the roses. And I think that after you read the piece, you can go back to this first paragraph and understand that the idea of supremacy is already being dealt with in this first paragraph, because the roses are clearly the queen of the garden in this description. It says, as for the roses, you could not help feeling they understood that roses are the only flowers that impress people at garden parties. The green bushes bowed down as though they had been visited by archangels. So there is a lot in this piece. And as you go back through and maybe revisit it, or if you watch that video, you'll see that there are these symbols of class distinction and the idea that one class is superior to another class. And that is demonstrated even in the flowers that are in the garden. And it's clear also with the Sheridans. So the big issue comes up in the story with this idea of the marquee. The marquee is like a big tent, like I showed you this one that's here. Here's a picture of a different type of marquee that we might have for an outdoor party, a wedding, something like that nowadays. And what happens at the beginning of the story is Laura Sheridan, it's not really described how old she is, but she's a teenager. She's not a woman in her own right. Her mother is the head of the household, and she gets told, because everybody else is kind of busy or indisposed, her other brothers and sisters, her dad, she gets told to go and deal with the people that are putting up the marquee for the party that's happening later that evening. Now, she's young. So she's maybe 14, 15 years old, something like that. And she's given the task to go and direct the grown-up men that are putting up the marquee. Now, just think about the class situation there, right? Like here comes this wealthy girl down from the house to come and tell these working men in their 30s, 40s, whatever, what to do and to kind of like be their boss. And so that is weird and also uncomfortable, but it's uncomfortable for Laura too, because she kind of recognizes that that's weird. But the mother insists that she goes to do it so she can start to learn how to handle business, like how to deal with people. But the dynamic is sort of crippled by the fact that, not a lot of 30, 40-year-old grown-up people like to be ordered around by 14-year-olds. It's just not a pleasant thing, right? So she goes down and she has to navigate that. So they send Laura because her sister, Josie, by the way, when you read this piece, I don't know about you, but the first time I ever read it, I read Jose. My husband's name is Jose, so I read Jose, and then it's like the butterfly always came down in silk petticoat and kimono jacket, and I was like, whoa, is this like a gender bender situation or what's happening? But then you realize as the story goes on that it's Josie, her sister. So we pronounce that Josie for this story. So they send Laura down, and she's got some bread and butter with her. And another really key symbol that gets carried through the piece is the food. So the food that rich people eat is apparently different from the food that us common people eat, because she gets embarrassed that she's got bread and butter. She should have something fancier, she feels, because she's, you know, coming from the house and she's the daughter of the wealthy guy. The workers are the type of people who should be eating bread and butter. So she kind of hides it, and she kind of like puts it away, because in order for her to be an authority over these people, she should be establishing her superiority, right? So that's the thing with the bread and butter. They make a big deal of it. And so if you don't get the class distinctions, then that's not super clear. Later on, they deliver some cream puffs that are specially made, and the food that's being created for this party. There's like little sandwiches that have flags in them saying what kind of filling they have. So it's like one of those fancy kind of parties. But that's not something that, say, the workers that are putting up the marquee would ever do in their lifetime. That's not something that they would involve. They just want to eat a sandwich, right? So food is another way that the author here tries to make it clear to us that there are distinctions in class, and food becomes a symbol in that way. She even says here, Laura wished now that she had not got the bread and butter, but there was nowhere to put it, and she couldn't possibly throw it away. She blushed and tried to look severe. So she tried to look like bossy, but you know, it's kind of hard when you're 14 to look bossy. She's copying her mother's voice, so she's learning how to be like, you know, an aristocrat. She's being told that she needs to practice that. So she has this conversation with the men that are putting up the tent, and where the location should be. He suggests a different spot, and so on and so forth. And they have this discussion, and I put a note there about blurring the lines of superiority, and that happens throughout the piece. And so there's questions, and Laura starts wondering, you know, how am I the boss here? These people know their business. They're, you know, they do this every day. She notices that he has haggard looking eyes, and she takes his advice about where the tent should be put up, and so on and so forth. But that is kind of like she's trying to find her voice in that situation. Already the men are starting to take everything, and she notices that one of them picks up a sprig of lavender out of the garden. It's like a flower, and it smells like, you know, they use it in a lot of aromatherapy type stuff. And he smells it, and she looks at it, and she's like, why would somebody like that do that sort of thing? Like, why would he pick up a lavender and smell it? Like, that's not a thing. That's not a thing for a working class person to do. So you can start to see the classism happening, just that she's got these assumptions that somebody who works, you know, labors for a living wouldn't stop to smell the flowers. You know, she's got a pretty stereotypical view of what worker people must be like. And she says, why couldn't she have workmen for friends rather than the silly boys she danced with and who came to Sunday night supper? So she's already starting to have that realization. How come there are these lines that we don't cross in society? Why don't I have any friends that are like these workers? It's because of your parents and your family, dear, right? And their choices to separate you from them. So we get this idea right off that the Sheridans are elitist, they're privileged. They're so privileged and elitist that they don't even recognize the need for certain behaviors. We'll talk about that in a minute, because there's going to be a tragedy and in the piece, and Laura reacts to that very differently than the other Sheridans do when that happens. So she takes a big bite of her bread and butter, and she starts thinking of herself as like a line crosser, right? Like, oh, I'm just like a work girl, as she trots back up to her mansion to get ready for her garden party. So there's an irony there, obviously. So Laurie is her brother, and they have a little conversation. They're talking about the garden party, and there's the outside noise of the workers putting up the structures for the party, and there's her thoughts, and she thinks about all kinds of things about the air and being out of doors and how the light is glinting on the picture frames. And I think what we're supposed to notice there is that she's got time to think about those things. If you're the worker out there doing your job, if you're the construction guy, if you're the road guy, if you're the blacksmith, you're out there working. You don't have time to think about how the sun is glinting on something. You know what I mean? Like, you're rolling up your sleeves and getting the job done. And so there's another class distinction. Just the fact that Laura has time to think about such things, how darling the little light spots are on the carpet, you know, that is another distinction, that she has time to do that. So the florist shows up, all these deliveries start happening. They start moving things around within the house, and they're singing a song, which is ironic. So they get the piano because they're moving everything out into the garden for the party that night. There's going to be a band, so they're moving the piano out, like we all have a piano in our houses, right? That's normal. And they say, "Oh, let's have a song." And so they play this song about how tiresome life is and how short it is, and you know, all these bad things happen in life, and we cry, and then that's it. Life is over. And so they sing this song about, you know, the drudgery of life when they don't even have any drudgery in their life. Their big drudgery is, oh my goodness, we forgot to put the flags on the little sandwiches. So that is super ironic, because the very people who are out toiling for their garden party and will not be able to enjoy it are the people who sing that kind of song, because they do have a weary life. There's a lot of discussion with the cook, um, and Sadie, who's a servant. They don't have the little signs for the sandwiches, and so they have to make them. Oh no. Then the cream puffs show up. I was talking about that. So anytime food pops up in this piece, it's to demonstrate the difference in the classes. They've ordered these special cream puffs, like donut-y things, and they kind of sneak one. It's so decadent right after breakfast to eat one. So they do, though. And that's when they find out that one of the delivery guy who brings those tells them that there's been an accident and a man's been killed down on the road. And he's from the tenements, the cottages that are near their property, that they always look at with like disdain. They always look at those like, oh, it's such an eyesore, those little cottages, and all the people that live there are kind of, you know, disheveled and dirty and all that stuff. Right here is where you have a line about that. This is on page 6. They were the greatest possible eyesore, and they had no right to be in that neighborhood at all. So she's talking about the cottages there, and that's where the man who's been killed is from. He had several children, a wife. So if you're wealthy and the head of the household dies, your grief is there, obviously, but you also don't have to worry about how you're going to be feeding your children. You probably have, not at this time, but nowadays, you'd have insurance. Their insurance was their estate, their investments, things like that. So they didn't have to worry about themselves. But this worker who has been killed has left his wife and his children. And if he's not making money for them, they don't have food. And that's a totally different experience. And it goes over the heads of all of the Sheridans, except Laura kind of goes, well, we should not have the party. Like, we should cancel the party because this guy's been killed down on the road. And so she describes the poverty of those little buildings and so on, so that we get the idea. That's a clue for us to understand that, you know, this upper class family would be okay financially if Mr. Sheridan, something happened to him. But this lower class family won't. And there's that double grief of what do we do now? Like, I have to live without my husband, without a father for my children, and what do I do for food? How do I pay rent? Like, what do I do? So there's this whole discussion because Laura feels moved by the fact that this man has died. I don't think all those financial things occur to her, but she knows that it's a shame that that happened. And she talks with her mother and with her sister about it, and nobody thinks that they should cancel the party. She thinks they should cancel the party. Like, how's it going to be for that lady to hear their party and their music and their laughter on the day that her husband died? And she's like, it's sort of like rude. And the mother's like, we don't even know that lady. Kind of like, well, we can make our own decisions. And because we don't know those people, we don't have to concern ourselves with our decisions based on them. So it's just about the inconsiderate quality of that sort of privileged, blind to their privilege people. She says, the mother says, I can understand how they keep alive in those pokey little holes. We should still be having our party, shouldn't we? And Laura had to say yes to that, but she felt like it was wrong. So Laura's the one who's having this conflict about knowing that something's wrong about that. She can't put her finger on it, but her mother is the person that she's supposed to learn from and, respect. So she's kind of like, okay, but it still feels wrong. And so she and her sister, the mother and the sister, both are like, what are you talking about? Of course, we're going to still have our party. It's not until she gets into her own room, the mother gives her this special hat that she's got for the party. And she looks at herself in the mirror, and that's when she realizes that everything's kind of blurry, and I'll just go to the party like my mother says and deal with the other stuff later. So they go to the party, and they have the party there in their backyard. The people show up, and that's not really described very much. They have sandwiches. The party is not, even though it's called the garden party, the party really isn't the main feature of the piece. The main feature of the piece is this conflict that Laura has in her position. And so they start talking a little bit toward the end of the party. Mr. Sheridan says, did you hear about the accident that happened? And the mother's like, well, yeah, it almost ruined the party because Laura wanted to cancel it. And so they talk about that, and it's determined that in order to sort of appease Laura, the mother says, well, why don't you package up the leftover food and take it down to the man's wife and give it to her. And that way, we'll be contributing a little bit to helping them out. And she says, but mother, do you really think that's a good idea? Again, how curious she seemed to be different from them all, from her other family members, to take scraps from their party. Would the poor woman really like that? And they're like, of course, her children need to eat, like, what are you talking about? And you know what? Take some of the extra lilies down to her too. And so the reason that seems awkward is because Laura's like, this lady needs something more than like cream puffs. That's not even a nutritious thing to eat. She's like, this woman needs a different kind of help, not like our leftover stuff. But Mrs. Sheridan and the other Sheridans are like, oh, yes, that's perfect, Charity. Let them eat cake, right? So they push her to go and take the stuff down there. And the closer she gets to the cottage, she's got like a basket. They decide not to take the flowers. And she's got this basket of food that's been wrapped up from the party, little sandwiches, with egg salad and cucumbers and all kinds of little fancy things. And she's taking it down to them. And the sun is setting. That's kind of an important thing to realize, because the sun is also setting on Laura's sort of naivete in her life status. Because she goes down and she realizes the closer and closer she gets, the the differences between where she lives and where this family lives. And I think it's an important thing to note about funerals at this time. I made a note here on the side. Funeral homes existed, but they were not generally used very much except wealthy people. Until maybe the 40s or so, people had visitation at their own houses, which is very strange for us, but they would take the person who passed and they would put them on a table or a bed or someplace in the house. And people would come by the house, bring food, like a wake, bring food and, greet the family and so on. But the person wasn't you know, in a different place. They were there in the house. And so you'd go by, you greet the family, take them food or whatever, and then you would go and, view the person who had passed, say your goodbyes, say your prayers, whatever it is that you were going to do. So it's just like what you do at a funeral home nowadays, except now it's kind of morbid to think that you would have your loved one in your living room dead for, a day or two. Especially, well, in the 20th century, they would have been embalmed most of the time, not all the time. In any case, so where she's going down there, she realizes that she's probably going to have to go and look at the man, because you go in, you greet the family. It's the thing that you do is you go and you look at the person and you say, blessings or whatever. So she keeps getting closer and closer and she gets more nervous about it. It was a mistake to have come. She knew all along it was a mistake. So should she cross that class line and try to give condolences for the family, or how's that going to be perceived by these people? Of course, she realizes she doesn't know anything about the way these people think, these working class people. And that's part of the message that Mansfield is sending. She doesn't know anything about it, so it's hard for her to make decisions about it. When she gets to the door, they part for her, which is weird because she's young, she's a teenager. And the reason they do that is because they can tell from her clothing and whatever, she's not one of them. And so she gets sort of like, special treatment. They part and she goes in and she asks for Mrs. Scott, and they have this whole conversation. Her sister, the widow's sister, is the one that kind of like leads her around, and she's got food and she puts it there. And the widow is totally out of it. She's kind of unable to greet her. She is overwhelmed with grief, and also the pressure of what that means for her life. And so the sister goes and takes her in to see the man, and she notices how peaceful he looks. He was dreaming. Never wake him up again. His head was sunk in the pillow. His eyes were closed. They were blind behind the closed eyelids. He was given up to his dream. And then she starts thinking about, just life circumstances, because I think a lot of us do that in funeral situations. What did garden parties and baskets and lace frocks matter to him? He was far from all those things. He was wonderful, beautiful, because he's released from all of the stressors of life. While they were laughing and while the band was playing, this marvel had come to the lane. So she's juxtaposing the party that they were having with the death that these other people were having. And she sees it as a happy circumstance because he's delivered from his existence. But all the same, you had to cry. And she couldn't go out of the room without saying something to him. So she says, "Forgive my hat." Her hat isn't appropriate for a funeral. It's appropriate for a party. So there's another symbol, right? She's showing up like this visitation is a party, because she's still dressed in her party outfit with her party food. And she's out of place, obviously, in more ways than one. So she leaves, and at the very end, there's a little bit of an ambiguous ending, because she comes out, she's overwhelmed with what she's just seen, the peacefulness that she didn't really expect to be on the face of this man, this dead man. And her brother's there because her mother was worried about her. So she sent her older brother down to collect her and make sure she was all right. And he says, "Are you crying?" And she's like, "No." And she was. It says Laura shook her head. She was. Laurie put his arm around her shoulder. "Don't cry," he said in a warm, loving voice. "Was it awful?" Because she was looking at a dead person. He's trying to protect her through the whole piece, he didn't even want her to know that the person had died. And there's another element of privilege, right? If people are protected by their families and they don't understand the classes and they're completely oblivious to class distinctions, then they go through their whole lives not understanding that. And Lori clearly is one of those people. And she says, no, it was marvelous. But isn't life, and she can't really finish, maybe because she's young or maybe because the realization, she hasn't thought about it enough of what she's seeing between the classes. And he says, isn't it? And so there's a question of does her brother share in her viewpoint and in the realization, the epiphany that she's starting to have, or not, right? Or does he just sort of finishing her thought so that they can go back home and continue to live their privileged life? So I think that the significance of this story is, for the modernism movement, the idea that there's a growing class awareness. Mansfield is certainly aware of it because she's writing about it here in this piece. And so maybe that leads later, I mean, not directly, obviously, real life situations lead to civil rights movements and so on later in the 20th century. But you can tell in the first quarter of the century that some writers are starting to address that and the class distinctions that some people aren't even aware of, even though they're taking advantage of those class situations. So Laura represents that awakening, that realization. So is there anything from the story that you want me to go back over? I think I went through it pretty thoroughly, but if you have something, you can put it in the chat. Likewise, if there are any questions from the study guide that you want me to talk about, then I'd be glad to do that. If you want to look those questions over and let me know what you think. You can put a number in the chat if you want me to talk about any of them. Number 6. What does the marquee come to represent in the story? Okay, so the marquee is the place where the party is happening. So the way that the workers look at the marquee is it's a job, right? They're getting paid to put it up. It's a thing that they have done many, many times. For the Sheridans, it's a symbol of their success that they're able to even throw this garden party, right? It's not necessary to have a garden party. Nobody has to have a garden party, but they're having one, and they're having one even despite the tragedy that happened right down the street, because they can afford it. They can afford all the little fancy foods and afford to hire people to put up a tent and all those things. So the marquee is kind of like a touch point in the piece where we can see that the workers are there to take the orders of the wealthy people and put this up. It's a job for them. And for the family, it's like a fun thing to do. It's not fun for the workers, but they're getting paid. So it's about, here we're sort of catering to you, right? You want to have a garden party, like, I don't understand garden parties, but I'll put up your tent. So it's kind of like a touchstone of the different ways that the levels of society operate. And the garden party, because the story is sort of mainly told from the perspective of the Sheridans, the garden party is an elitist event. And they're not going to be inviting anybody who's not on their same social level to the party. And it's just a job for the others. So it kind of like has that distinguishing quality. Are there any other ones that you want me to talk about? I think I talked about a lot of them as I was going through the story. All right, well, I don't see anything else there. So the last order of business for today is for me to ask you if you want to have a class meeting tomorrow to go over or have an opportunity to ask questions about things from the study guide. So if you want to do that, go ahead and put a thumbs up or a yes or something in the chat so that I know. If you'd rather have the period tomorrow to finish up assignments, study for the exam on your own, then you don't have to put anything. What do y'all think? Okay. All right, I'm guessing that means that y'all don't need to have class tomorrow. I'll be available, so if you have a question on the study guide, you can certainly email me or use my Google Voice number, and I will respond to you. I don't want to leave you hanging about the exam, but sometimes it's just better if you study on the things, you know, that you might need to. Do you want to look at the study guide a little bit? You can get it right here. So just a reminder that these are the terms that will be showing up for the short answers where it says terms, concepts, people on each one of the units. Those are the things that could show up for you to define and connect to a piece of literature and explain how it connects. Same thing here for the Victorians, and same thing here for the modernists and postmodernists. All of the lectures and study guides are linked under each unit so that you can go back to those if you need to. I'll put today's video here. It's the last one that I need to put in on the study guide. I did shorten the exam significantly, so there will be 10 short answers and 2 essays, just so that you are aware of that. If anything else comes up, then feel free to email me. Remember that all of the coursework, except for the exam, closes tomorrow at midnight. So after that time, then time will be up for those. So that way I can start getting close to figuring out your final grades. All right. I want to say, because this is my last opportunity to say that I know this was a tough semester. I know that you know, you all worked really hard to get to this point. I'm proud of your hard work and your tenacity in showing up for classes, and I appreciate that you have been consistent with that, especially the people who are here right now. And I hope that those of you who are juniors I'll see you next year in person. And for those of you who are graduating, I will see you at graduation. So hopefully you had, looking back on it, I know that it was a lot of work, but I'm hoping that you look back on the semester and appreciate all of the learning that you did. So with that, I will sign off for the last time for class. If something comes up, you can just let me know. I'll communicate with you, and I hope that y'all have a good day and a good summer too. Bye.